There have been multiple points this year where I've had to check my calendar and make sure that it's not October, because Halloween has come very early for horror game fans. That's because of releases like the Dead Space remake that happened earlier this year, and now the incredibly superb Resident Evil 4 remake. Hi everybody, I'm Giovanni Colantonio. I'm the gaming section lead over at Digital Trends, and I'm here with my review of Resident Evil 4. The new version, not the old one. There's another one. Though this time, we're not just getting another port to a new platform, this is a full-on remake of the Nintendo GameCube Classic. But before I talk about that, I actually want to go back and talk about this year's Dead Space remake first, because there's some important context there. Now, like a lot of you, I really adored the recent Dead Space remake that came out this year. It looks beautiful, it plays beautiful, it does a great job at modernizing a horror classic. But at the same time, it did leave me just a tiny bit underwhelmed. That's because nothing about the Dead Space remake actually changed my relationship to Dead Space, if that makes sense. If I hadn't played it, I would have had the exact same feelings on Dead Space as I did having not played it. My feelings on the series kind of remain unchanged. That's given me a lot of time to ask the question, what should a video game remake actually do? Should they just be totally faithful, one-to-one copies of the games that we loved, or is there space to do something more with them, to reinvent them and make us think about stories in a totally different way? And I'm glad this Resident Evil 4 remake is out now, because it gives a really good case for why doing that reinvention approach might actually be the way to go for video games going forward. The important thing to know about this remake is that it is not a one-to-one version of the Resident Evil 4 that you grew up and played as a kid. It's actually way more radical than marketing has let on. Certain story beats have been totally changed. Characters are way deeper. Set pieces are different. Locations are different. Obviously, it looks a lot better. The combat is incredibly different. It's because Capcom isn't just trying to redo Resident Evil 4 and make a quick buck. They're actually taking a lot of time to think about what Resident Evil 4 means in 2023. Let's talk about a couple of ways that it does that. I'll focus on two things in particular. The first is its story.
A most warm welcome to my castle, Mr. Kennedy. Who the hell are you?
The core story here is pretty much the same as it was in the original. You have Leon S. Kennedy, who's a government agent who's tasked with tracking down the president's daughter. That takes him to this remote, rural Spanish village that's filled with villagers that have been infested with parasites and want to kill him. They're basically zombies, but they're not zombies, they're kind of zombies. We'll just call them zombies. The original game did have an emphasis on story, but it was also kind of silly. It was a little bit of a Saturday morning cartoon, and that's something that's been very beloved about it over the years. Its characters were a little paper thin. Leon was kind of just a lovable himbo dummy, and Ashley was kind of just an annoying companion, but this time that's been really changed. The story is a lot different because there's more to it. I won't get into specific details because part of the joy of this is discovering that for yourself, but needless to say, characters have real arcs this time. They're not just one-dimensional. We get to see a lot more of characters like Leon and Ashley, and they both get true full arcs. The way that I would describe this change is that this version is less like a cartoon, and it's more like a modern action movie. And if you've played a lot of recent video games, you know that that's something that's kind of trendy right now. A lot of games are trying to mimic Hollywood and make big action set pieces, and that's kind of what Resident Evil 4 does here. And it does it really successfully. This is a thrilling game that takes all of the amazing set pieces from the original and does them even bigger and better in some cases. Now, this might rub some people the wrong way. I think there are people who really, really love the goofy tone of the original, and while this one is still gleefully silly, it is more modern and serious in some sense. But the thing is, if you love that goofy version of Resident Evil 4, that already exists. You can go play it. You can dust off your GameCube. You can get it on PC. You can even play it on the Oculus Quest in VR. That version's never going away, and it still plays great. What Capcom is doing here is offering a truly new version of Resident Evil 4 that feels like it fits into 2023. The goal here is making it feel like a modern game, and that takes me to another standout feature in this remake, which is its combat system. In the original Resident Evil 4, combat was probably a little stiffer than you remember. Leon would actually have to stand still to fire his gun, and that could make the combat feel a little start and stop. In this, that's been totally changed. He can now move while shooting, and that's just one of the small changes. That alone makes things feel faster and more action-packed, but in addition to that, he can do a lot more with his knife this time, which is a wonderful change. He can backstab enemies and kill them in one go, kind of like you could do in Wolfenstein or The Last of Us. You can use your knife to parry enemy attacks, even blocking a chainsaw, which seems insanely impossible, but I'm here for it. I even ran into a situation where I managed to deflect a flying axe out of midair, which made me feel very cool, and that's kind of what the game is going for. It's trying to make you feel like more of an action hero. The original Resident Evil 4 did do that, but by today's standards, it doesn't really feel up to par with a lot of today's games. With its approach to combat, the remake is trying to take something that felt really innovative and new at the time and make it feel innovative and new again. I can already imagine that we're going to see a lot of wild YouTube videos where people just make the most out of this combat system, kind of like we saw when The Last of Us 2 came out. And The Last of Us is the game that I actually really want to focus on here, because I think it highlights what this project does so well. Let me take you back in time. If you never played the original Resident Evil 4 when it came out on GameCube, it was a huge moment in the 2000s. That's because it was a major departure for the Resident Evil series at the time, which up to that point had just been kind of slow survival horror games. This was a full-on action game that was a lot faster and more fun and goofier by comparison, and it was incredibly influential because of that. Not only did it change the trajectory of the Resident Evil series, but you could say that it built the framework for the action horror genre. You don't really get Dead Space without Resident Evil 4. I'd even go a step further. It kinda set the template for what would become the narrative third-person action-adventure game. You kind of don't get The Last of Us without Resident Evil 4. And here's the thing about remaking a game as important as that. If you were to do a one-to-one recreation of everything you loved about the original Resident Evil 4 right now, you wouldn't really get its influence. That's because parts of it are kind of dated by today's standards. That's not a knock against it. Gaming has just evolved so much in that time, and a lot of that has come from building off of what Resident Evil 4 did well. And so what Capcom does here that's really brilliant is they don't just remake Resident Evil 4 and give everybody a nice nostalgia trip. Instead, they're re-examining it through the lens of the 20 years worth of games that came out of Resident Evil 4. What does it mean to make Resident Evil 4 in a world post The Last of Us? That's kind of the question that we get at here, and getting to see that is kind of incredible if you love video game history. You really get to see the straight line between something like Resident Evil 4 and The Last of Us when you're looking at a really modern version of the former. It makes you appreciate why the original Resident Evil 4 was so ahead of its time. I mean, so much of the stuff that works here is just stuff that was in the original game. How weird it was, how well the story is paced, some really memorable set pieces and enemy types. That part of it has remained unchanged, but what has changed is those modern language touches, the things that make its combat feel new and fast and slick, the things that make its story feel more nuanced like we get from today's games. That should be something that excites fans of the original game. You aren't just going to get the exact same game that you've played 100 times here. Instead, you are going to get something that makes you think about it differently, that makes you reflect on what it did well, that makes you reflect on how it changed the games that came after it. It is an incredible historical project just as much as it is a preservation of Resident Evil 4. And if you come to it from that approach, I think you'll really adore what this game does. You have to put your nostalgia to the side. You have to be willing to accept what it's doing and all the changes that it's making and the way that it's modernizing in ways that maybe aren't going to feel like they're true to the original. At the end of the day, they kind of are true to the original. It's just true to the original looking at it 20 years later. That's what that game might have looked like if it had been made today. That makes for an incredibly thoughtful revisit that honors the legacy and past of Resident Evil 4 while also placing it in the present and thinking about the future. I think that you'll see a lot of aspects of this game carried over into Resident Evil games going forward, and honestly, maybe even at a more broad level within the video game industry. It's teaching us how remakes can be different, how they can add to an experience, how they can change our relationship to it, how they can make us think about why these games are important and why we still love them, why they're enduring classics. Because of all that, this version of Resident Evil 4 is honestly just as good as the original was when it first came out. It's once again a groundbreaking project that's every bit as fun and inventive and weird as it was when it came out on the GameCube. Except this time, you get to experience it in the context of all the games that came after it, and that makes for a really special experience. I'm not going to say another word here because honestly, I kind of want you to experience it for yourself. But I'm curious as to what you think. What makes a really good video game remake? What do you want to see in something like Resident Evil 4? What do you look for when you revisit a game? Let us know in the comments below. All I'll say is that I hope you see in this version of Resident Evil 4 what I see in it, because I think that this is a great path forward for the video game industry. If we're going to keep remaking games that honestly hold up pretty well and probably don't need to be remade, I think this is the exact way that you do it. Make me think about it differently. Make me feel something new about it. Chop my head off with a chainsaw again. I'm here for it.